I'm speaking in good faith today with a pastor and a musician, William G. Carter. Bill, thank you for speaking with me today.
Steve, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation.
And I love that I can speak to you from this is your home or your office in Pennsylvania, I believe.
This is my office in Pennsylvania, pastor's office at First Presbyterian Church, Clark Summit, Pennsylvania.
Well, William G. Carter, here goes the official bio, has a dual career as a jazz pianist and Presbyterian minister. He is head of staff at First Presbyterian Church of Clark Summit, Pennsylvania, as you heard, and leader of the Pres Bebop Quartet, a highly regarded speaker, teacher, workshop leader, and composer. He's regarded as a national authority on the use of jazz music in liturgical settings. We will definitely address that. He's the author of 11 books and numerous published articles and editor of the jazz hymnal, Swing a New Song to the Lord. You were having far too much fun with the phrasing and the music.
Guilty.
Jazz Resources for Worship. He's a graduate of Binghamton University and Princeton Theological Seminary. And you have a podcast that I just subscribed to this morning called The Spirit of Jazz that already I was quite intrigued with, just the little bit that I've heard so far. You tell this story of going before, I think it was a church board, to apply to be their minister, and they say, "What are you going to play? Are you going to play the piano for us?" Tell me this story.
Sure. Well, the way that Presbyterians do it, at least in the North, is you lead a service on a Sunday, you preach a sermon, and then everybody there gets to vote. And the vote went well. But then somebody who knew my background stood up in the back pew, on the pew, and said, "We heard you preach, and that was fine, but why don't you play something for us?" And I said, "Well, that's not why I'm here. I came to this church because of its great music program." And they said, "Well, that's what you think." So they cajoled me into stomping out a rock and roll version of Amazing Grace. And then somebody said, "What else are you going to do?" I said, "Well, I'm going to go say goodbye to my other congregation right now. I'll see you in a couple of weeks." And so I thought I was putting it on hold, just as I did when I went to seminary. I love to play the piano, had a lot of experience with that. But I think the Holy Spirit has other plans. And just the music kept bubbling up, and the invitations kept coming, and curious and intriguing ways. And ever since that fateful date, which was in September 1990, I've been working at weaving together music and ministry as a coherent whole.
Well, the new book is called Thriving on a Riff, William G. Carter, Jazz and the Spiritual Life. But as a pastor, you know that from the time of the Psalms, at least, music has been mixed together with ritual and with faith.
Well, that's right. The unfortunate thing, or maybe fortunate in another sense, is that when the Psalms were written down and eventually published, at least in our form of being published, all those texts lost their tunes. Every once in a while, one will have a superscription that says Psalm of David, or a tune to the lilies, or something like that. But there was no way in antiquity that we know of where music could be documented. Music was probably made in a mentor situation, and so it was copied and it was represented. And the blessing in that, I believe, is that every community of faith that prays the Psalms has the opportunity to represent it with fresh music. Which is certainly my tradition, which goes through Geneva and Scotland. Presbyterians have loved the Psalms as others have.
I want to ask about how music can change people and affect people spiritually. That's something we innately feel. I mean, we once did a music appreciation in our congregation, and the week before, and this just about drove some people crazy, there was an entire service with no music. And it just felt like it was pretend. It did not feel like a real worship service. And then the next Sunday, of course, it was all music, and we were all so relieved. But it made a huge point. It made a huge point. What do you think it is about music that works with worship?
Well, I think it seeps into our pores in a different way. The people who study how we learn discover that with multiple intelligences, some see and read, and some hear, and some do. But I think there's an extra multiple intelligence for music, that music can transmit passion and information and hope and despair. Um, and that a skillful musician literally knows how to work the crowd.
Mm.
I didn't understand this at first. When I was a musician growing up, I thought we just played tunes to fill in the hour. But I had a wonderful instructor who said, well, start with something that catches their interest, kind of a medium tempo, and then go a little deeper and take a breath and then energize them again, so that what happens is a set of music, just like a worship service, is like following a narrative. So music works in a narrative way as well, like a good symphony with different movements. It carries us on a journey. And I think that's one of the ways it begins to change us, if only to open us to the capacity of beauty, or to drive us to the further depths of our humanity, or surprise us and awaken us to maybe a holy or spiritual presence that we weren't aware of beforehand.
Well, you talked about to carry them on a journey. Have you had to carry your congregations on a bit of a journey to expand their minds to jazz in the worship service?
Oh, sure. Oh, sure. I mean, about a year and a half after I landed here, our organist was despairing. She couldn't find a substitute for a Labor Day weekend, and looked all over the place, and no one was available. And in desperation, she asked at a committee meeting, could you play the hymns? And I said, sure. And she said, are you going to jazz them up? And I said, well, is that all right? Why not? And when we opened the door that day, the sanctuary was full for a holiday weekend when most people would be at the lake. And I had put together a slightly jazzed up service. And at the end of it, they asked a question that frightened me. Will you do this again next week? And I thought, well, no, it's not the Bill show. But we do have choirs, and we have an organist, and we have other musicians. And the journey, like every journey, any substantial journey, is going to have some twists in the road and some potholes and maybe some opposition. And as we began to develop an annual jazz service on that weekend, kind of the last foray of the summer, we had a couple people say, well, I'll see you the week after that. I'm going to take that week off. They couldn't perceive of jazz as being a container of the holy. Mm. They were so consumed maybe with popular misrepresentations. This is music created by drug addicts, or it belongs in smoky bistros or dens of iniquity. But they hadn't heard it as a form of art. So that's been the journey, and that journey has beckoned me forward as well. And at this point in my life, having been here now 34 years, I see it as a spiritual journey. There's a benevolent, graceful force that has been inviting us forward to step into it.
I hope I get this quote right from the book, that you say something to the effect of, musicians are famously non-judgmental about each other's human foibles and failings. Yeah. And that actually seemed like church to me.
Well, church at its best. Yeah. We all hunger for a community where people take us as we are. And I have found that on the bandstand in some ways that I haven't always found in the church. And I say that as a church leader. But there's, when I go on tour with the guys for a week out of the year or so, we get in the car, and within 30 seconds, we're laughing, we're telling jokes, we're talking about our kids, we're sharing our medical struggles, all the above, and it's real, it's authentic, and I I experience grace that way, and in that welcome. And so I constantly am wondering and encouraging my church leaders here, what would it be like for others to experience that sort of welcome and that openness as well?
Do you write all of the poems? They're uncredited, and they appear throughout. So I'm assuming they're yours.
They are mine, and they were all done pretty spontaneously with a minimal amount of editing.
Well, I wonder, do you have your book handy?
I do.
I'm looking at page 85, and we get into this chapter called Improvisation Lessons in Dissonance. And if you wouldn't mind reading this, I think this is a sort of a good entree into understanding new music and worship.
Okay. Here goes. Lesson in Dissonance. She pushes down two adjacent piano keys, flinches, declaring, "That's ugly." Maybe. Any two notes side by side could bite one another in bitter harmony. Play them again. Sustain the cluster. Let tension ring. Still ugly, perhaps. Resolution will not come easily, like hearts out of phase. Hit them again, together. Pedal to the floor, tension sustained. Perceiving the unheard reference tone, now vibrations resonate. Strings hum with one another. Beauty is hidden in the dissonance. Listen until you hear it. Listen again.
Beautiful. Now, that beauty is hidden in the dissonance. That implies a necessary bit of searching or contemplation about it.
It does.
You have a beautiful example. This is with John Coltrane's "A Love Supreme."
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you would mind talking about the story of you finding that album and actually the angularity or maybe even the ugliness of it in a way being a spiritual balm. Do you mind telling that story?
Well, certainly. My folks had sent me next door to help out a neighbor who was digging a drainage ditch, of all things. I was 17 or so. It was a Saturday morning. I really didn't want to go, but, off I went. And shovel in hand, I was talking to a man I had not met, another friend of the neighbor. And he found out I was a jazz musician, or wanted to be, and he said, "Have you heard John Coltrane's A Love Supreme?" And I said, "Well, I've heard the name Coltrane. I really haven't found that." And for your listeners, this was back in the day before Spotify or Amazon Music, so you had to go to something called a record store and find it. And the best one was about 20 miles away. So I tucked away that music. He was going on about its beauty and picked it up when I was maybe a few months later, after I'd mowed a few more lawns, made a little more money, and put it on. And instantly, members of the household said, "Would you please turn that down?" It was harsh, it was strange, it was bizarre, and but I listened to the whole thing, all 38 minutes or whatever it is, that suite, and kind of tucked away and thought, well, I spent good money on this. I'm not going to throw out the album or give it away. And shortly after that, our family went through a medical crisis. My dad was diagnosed with a form of leukemia, and everything just went dark and shut down. And it turned out he was cured rather miraculously. But somewhere in that curing, I played the album again, this time with headphones, and the music found me. It's kind of like the theologian Belden Lane says about holy places. You don't find them, they find you. And I think that's sometimes spiritually how it works with music. Something kind of reaches you. And I heard the music then as a prayer. Again, that was before something called the internet, so you couldn't look up, type in "A Love Supreme" and discover that Coltrane had created that suite as a form of prayer, that he had positioned it so that it was tracing his own spiritual journey, and it was not the kind of traditional popularized Americanized success story of I found God or Jesus and suddenly everything turned out well. It was more I started the path, it healed me, and then there was more challenge, and in the end there's peace.
Mm-hmm.
Which is how Coltrane perceived it, which is, I think, a much more valid path. It, again, like Amazing Grace, many toils, snares, I have already come. There are bumps on the road, and yet there's something that carries us through, and the promise of that Sabbath, that rest, that peace, that restoration.
You talk about improvisation that's necessary, and in fact, one of the beautiful and intriguing things about jazz, also one of the reasons why no performance is necessarily exactly the same as another. How do you tie that to spiritual lives and the need for improvisation?
Need for improvisation. Well, it's a practical need, first of all. I mean, the person who has their day figured out before it begins is generally obsessed with control and frequently disappointed. So at what point, when we start our day, do we just kind of roll with things
Mm.
and draw on the skills that we have? Um, we're guided by our schedules, but schedules are, subject to change. And again, there's this narrativity, this unfolding. Improvisation at its earliest form in jazz music was simply messing around with the melody, adding a personal stamp to it, adding some nuances on the horn or the instrument you're playing, and speaking it through your instrument. So there was some give and take, especially with the other musicians, and that's kind of where the magic begins. This is largely communal music, a communal art form. With other art forms, the painter paints in solitude. The photographer gets up at dawn to catch the sunrise, but the jazz musician frequently works with others and creates magic with them. A lot of it can be anticipated, some of it can be generally planned, but when it happens, you want to be there.
Mm.
And that's, I think, what happens with improvisation. Now, the assumption is, and this frightens a lot of trained musicians, the assumption is that when you get a piece written down on paper, it's not finished. And which is why I dare to say in the book that written music is always a contradiction in terms. Music exists in the air.
Mm.
You can't capture it. You can only be there to participate in it, either as listener or musician. So, if that's true, then what if the written music or the prepared music is the launching pad, and then we dare to take the risks to step into the future based on what we've been playing?
And there's no
One,
guarantee it will go well.
none whatsoever. Uh, but for the skilled improviser, miracles happen. The great jazz pianist Brad Meldau just released an album called After Bach, which includes a couple of Bach preludes, and then he writes the music that if Bach were around today, he'd probably still be composing. And he
Mm.
does this spontaneously. And Bach was a great improviser, if only because he had 20 kids around the house dragging on his feet, and he had music to crank out for the next Sunday. So he was always working and creating. And we know that it was not written down all in advance. Some of it was played and then documented. He was still working it out. So this understanding, I think, helps us understand music as a breathing, living art form, and not something that's fixed and relies on perfection.
You share a story that caught my eye of Bobby McFerrin, being a piano player in Salt Lake City, so not far from where we are now. This is why it sort of caught my eye on the
That's
page.
right.
And then he hears what he called the voice,
Of course.
meaning God,
Hmm.
saying, "You're a singer now."
Hmm.
And sort of an act of faith that he says, "Okay, I've been playing the piano. What does this mean?" And then, of course, he goes on to have number one hit, Grammy awards. He's
Yeah,
known as a who knows that he plays the piano. That's like an afterthought now.
yeah, yeah.
Was there something, whether subtle or obvious, that you would call the voice, or something that called you to ministry? How did that happen in your life?
Oh,
I
I heard the
assume
voice. Yeah.
I assume you were already a believer, perhaps.
Yes, I was raised within the church. I had accepted what I had been taught, and I knew there was more to it than I had been taught. Which let this be a reminder to all of us in the religious sphere. We get some of it right, and there's even more.
Mm, mm.
So more of an expansive view of that. And as I began to explore options for my life, I thought it was going to be pre-med, and I'm in an institution of higher learning in the New York system and very scientific background. And I get in there and I realize this is not for me.
Mm.
In fact, I love to tell friends the story. I was in a science library studying calculus-based physics, and God spoke up and said, "Get out of here." But as I began to explore where might the door be opening for me, the idea of ministry surfaced, and I at first shrugged it off, thinking, "No, I'm a churchgoer, I'm a believer, but I'd rather listen to preachers than become one." And yet the door opened and opened and opened, and then with kind of rather a narrow view of my own spiritual life, I thought, well, if I'm going to be A, then I can't be B. If I'm
Mm.
going to be a pastor and a preacher, I can't be a jazz musician. And then over a number of more years, it just became more and more clear that the Spirit of God had other ideas. It's A plus B. And so the journey for me has been one not only of improving my skills however I can, but integrating them, living a whole life, not a segmented life.
So not pastor by day, pianist, jazz musician by night.
Yeah, yeah, and superhero on the weekends. No, not at all. It's. I mean, the the spiritual life is this life. It's the life that we have. It's not waiting to rest on a cloud with golden harps. It's this life, and the next life is the great mystery that awakens to us when we get there. But for here and now, how do we live joy? How do we live freedom? How do we live imagination? How do we build community? For me, those how do we address pain and racism and the ills of society? I mean, these are all deeply spiritual questions. If the spirit means anything, it means at least all of that. So
We
this book is actually my exploration of those kind of questions.
I read that you often ask people, "How has God found you through music?" Tell
Hmm.
me what that means, and maybe what kind of things how do they answer?
Well, I think about it for a while because they have not tended to think of music in that way. They've tended to think of music as a soundtrack
Hmm.
uh, to something else, or as entertainment, or as an event, but not as something that is a moment of communion or conflict or even challenge. So I had a friend who was going through a tough time and wondering, what was in store for them. They had lost a job, they had lost a marriage, the kids were alienated. And we were talking one time, and I suggested a couple things. He said, "What should I do?" I said, "Well, why don't you, first of all, start working through the Psalms, and especially the ones you don't know, because there's a lot of pain lifted as prayer." And I said, "And when you get home tonight," he was a classical musician with a great library of music. I said, do you have Barber's Adagio of strings for strings?
Mm,
And he said, well, yes. I said, okay, turn out all the lights, put on that recording, and just sink into it. And the next day he called and said, I've never heard it like that before. I
yeah.
said, well,
Eight minutes of catharsis.
yeah, yeah. I think an
Mm.
E flat minor or something was that it just drenched. And it was, he said, it was like I was being bathed in light and I didn't have to create it. I simply had to show up.
Wow.
And I think, again, we rush through so many things. We dismiss them, we commercialize them, we turn music into something that is consumed rather than something that consumes us.
So I had fun exploring as I prepared for this interview because you have more options than most of my guests. I read very interesting things about them or what they've said or written, but in this case I got to find you on YouTube with your quartet. And then I got to also find a Spotify playlist. Then I found the podcast. And one piece I'd love to feature a little bit about, if we could talk, if you could set this up for us. It's the one talking where you have sort of jazz and spoken word together. And you could talk about the album and the concept, but then where Jesus heals a blind man. And I don't want to say more than that. If you would
Okay.
walk us through that.
Some years ago, I was talking with my friend Dennis Dewey, who is a biblical storyteller, now semi-retired, upstate New York. And he's one of these people who inhabits a long story from the Bible. Like he can recite and retell the Gospel of Mark from memory, or the
Wow.
book of Revelation, at least the high parts. And he said, why don't we do the Gospel of John according to jazz? And I said, well, say more. And I said, well, he said, well, I'll tell a story and you guys accompany me. And I said, do you want us to improvise? He said, well, sometimes, and other times give us kind of a set background or setup. And so one of the stories was from chapter 9 in the Gospel of John, the man born blind, and Jesus finds him. And so we improvised that and then created kind of a setting of it. And the album is not widely known, although it is out there on our website and elsewhere. And so that's what this is. It's John chapter 9 with a storyteller, biblical storyteller, faithfully telling the text by heart, not by script, and then the band accompanying him.
And did you work on the music separately and then come together with him, or was it all in one?
I did. I said, well, we can't do the whole thing because that would take a few hours and no one's going to buy a CD that's a 3 CD set. He said, well, these are the stories I'm thinking. And so I began to explore keys and the feeling, the rhythmic background. We met for lunch in a little restaurant after the lunch hour, so we could, and they had a piano. We went into the side room and tried some stuff out. And then I kind of sent him some samples of what I was thinking, recorded from my piano at home. He said, let's do it. Went into the studio. I think everything but one was a first take.
Wow.
So everything was spontaneously done.
Mhm.
And we're very pleased with it.
I've heard a lot of people, including a friend of mine who is a principal at a junior high school, people were always saying, what can I do to keep my kids out of trouble? And he'd always say, sports, band, orchestra. Get them in group activities. So there's something about community. It wasn't just to keep the kids so busy they didn't have time to get in trouble, but it was to build relationships, I think. But there you are, for instance, in a jazz quartet. Is there something you learn about community in a setting like that that could apply to a church or just our communities in general,
Well,
spiritually?
a few things. First of all, everybody has something to offer and share. Second of all, we have to make room for others to do that and not dominate the conversation.
Mm.
And one particular piece of that with jazz is everybody is not the soloist all the time. Sometimes you back up, and sometimes you just need to be quiet and let them play. And that it's okay because it's like we're held in a certain kind of communal container. And it's like any relationship, a marriage or friendship, where there's a lot we can assume and presume because of the love and history that we share.
Hmm.
And I think, the gift of this is the sum is always greater than the parts. We can break down jazz and says, well, the bass player plays quarter notes and the drummer kind of keeps the rhythm stoked and the piano player punctuates it with harmony and then the saxophonist plays the melody. But honestly, the drummer can play the melody. The bass player is participating thoroughly in the harmony, and sometimes, at least in my case, the piano player plays too much. So you need to kind of find a good balance, and it all functions on listening to one another, which is the heart of an authentic community, and something that is sorely lacking in our nation today. People aren't listening to one another. They want to win by 47%, and that's not good enough. I think we can participate in one another's lives by, first of all, receiving one another and understanding one another's hurts as well as their hopes.
You serve your congregation or your community as you play. Do you have moments where you felt God is listening to me, to this music that I'm making right now?
Mm-hmm. I can remember moments in concerts or in recording sessions when I just felt like there was applause somewhere off stage. um, and it's fleeting, and I don't want to give into it too much lest my head be swollen and my ego pushed out of whack more than it normally is. But yeah, I do think there are moments when we resonate with the holy purposes for the universe. And we just affirm that, we're in this together, at least in this moment. And that has happened sometimes with music. Jazz is maybe the only form of music I know where mistakes that happen live are actually forgiven and must be forgiven. That wasn't like the piano recitals of my childhood where you had to play it perfectly. But in jazz, mistakes happen all the time. And as the great trumpeter told us, it's not the wrong note, it's the next note that matters.
Is that Miles Davis?
Miles Davis, yeah.
Yeah.
It's the next note. So you play the wrong note. There's a story I tell in the book about Herbie Hancock hitting the wrong chord, and Miles kind of gives him a sideways glance and makes the chord sound right by playing something fresh. And they go on from there.
That's a great story. I wonder, maybe it's fun to ask people maybe impossible questions, but can you put your finger on why in your life at any stage, and it may be different at different times, have you been a believer or thought, I believe in God?
I'm going to chew on that for a second. So you have
Sure.
to edit this out. I think I believe most days because I discern that the world does not depend on me, that there's a greater force, greater love at work than I could ever conceive or imagine. And this is not made up in my imagination. And then I see signs of that grace and that mercy all around me. And maybe more than anything else, the moments that warm my heart are the moments when I discern that something or someone is being healed. That something is being mended, that something's being fixed or in the process. The Jews have this great word, the Jewish mystics, the phrase tikkun olam, which means the healing of the world. And that guides their social principles. I've seen signs of that. and that's evidence for me of the holy, of God. And then I begin to read into and reflect on the narratives and the texts of my tradition and sometimes of other traditions. And I suddenly am given a name for this, or names for this, or ways to understand it. A lot of what we detect as scripture, it contains field reports of the same kind of benevolence at work in the world. And that's why I believe.
I love your description there of the field work and the healing. And you must have had times where you felt that wittingly or unwittingly you had been used as an instrument, no pun intended, to facilitate some of that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, there have been moments, lots of moments. You can't be a pastor for 39 years and a believer for a lot more without some of that bubbling up once in a while. But it's all an indication of what's happening behind the curtain. It's not something that, again, I would manufacture or do on my own. I mean, the great good humor of God is that I'll put together a sermon and I think I've really nailed it and I've said it well, and then I stand up and people are yawning. And the day when I have a headache and I had a fight with somebody in my family and I missed breakfast and I just talk, people say, you moved me today in ways you've never moved me before. And I think, well, maybe it's not about me. Maybe it's about me getting out of the way and just being one vessel among many.
Bill, I could spend all day talking to you. This is so interesting to me, and you're such a good storyteller and thinker. Could you read the poem on 194? This seems like we'll kind of do bookmarks for or bookends from the poem we started with and then ending with this one. I really love this.
Okay, and this is a true story. This is a improvisation, a poetic improvisation called "Are You Going to Talk About Heaven?" The thin, grizzled drummer removes cymbals from their stands. A curious soul, he asks, "So, you are writing a book? What is it about?" I pause to consider how to condense all these pages into 30 seconds of attention. Abundant life does not fit neatly in an instrument case. Stepping into my fermata, he asked fervently, "Are you going to talk about heaven?" What can we say of heaven, God's domain? Is it the period on the paragraph, the fine on the tune, or is it a comma with an eternity? Is heaven flooded with colorblind justice? Is everybody healed? Will hungry musicians eat after the gig? Here is what I know. Heaven is a jazz solo, sweeping all in its wake. Every foot taps, every head nods, every soul leans forward, and nobody wants it to end. Eyes glistening, he hears the music.
I can just picture that little moment after a gig taking down in that conversation. Thank you so much, Bill Carter, for speaking with me today in good faith.
Thank you, Steve. It's been a complete joy and pleasure.